On This Week in Enterprise Tech, it's the best of 2014. Try it on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust. This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Twit. This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 121, recorded December 19th, 2014, or December 22nd, 2014. The best of 2014. Welcome to Twit, This Week in Enterprise Tech. It's the show dedicated to the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and the geek who just wants to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, your guide to all things in the enterprise. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the best of 2014. Now, Curtis Franklin can't join us today. He's on special assignment trying to find out the source of the mystical Doge. But while he's gone, Brian, you want to talk about booth babes?
Oh, of course.
You want to define what a booth babe is first?
Well, our typical explanation of what a booth babe is someone from a typically Las Vegas or so forth modeling agency that's hired just to spruce up the booth.
That's right.
They don't necessarily know anything about it. They're just trying to appeal to the male of the industry to lure them into the booth.
Yeah, I like to call this the seedy side of the internet, of the enterprise. And we all know this. If you've ever gone to a conference, any sort of professional conference, be it the Consumer Electronics Show or Interop or ShmooCon, you're going to find that vendor, that manufacturer who believes that the way to get the most traffic to his or her booth is to stock it with college-age attractive women. Well, we had an interesting little experiment that was performed by Spencer Chen, who is the head of marketing for Frontback. It's a PR group specializing in these live events. At CES 2014, he had two booths that he had to stock for one customer. So same amount of material, just in two different locations. And with the company's blessing, he decided to do a little bit of a social thing. He stocked one booth with booth babes and the other booth with, well, elderly women, not the Powerpuff Girls, but pretty dang close. What he found was that the booth babe booth got less than 1/3 of the traffic and less than 1/2 of the leads of the supposedly unattractive booth. Now, this kind of blew his colleagues away. They didn't really understand why this happened. It went against all the traditional thought that you need these attractive women to draw in the young men, the middle-aged men, the technology men who are going to make the purchases, who are going to give you these leads. But his numbers are actually pretty compelling. I'd like to see this experiment done a few more times before I write off the booth babe entirely. But Brian, Does this mean something different for enterprises, for businesses who go to these shows to show off their wares?
You know, I can't speak for a lot of other enterprises, but when I was doing a lot of work with the military and especially military contracting, we would avoid the booths with the booth babes because that told us, the marketing people, didn't have a good enough product to attract us on their own merit. In fact, Wayne Rash and I were blitzing it across the Comdex trade show floor many years ago. And the only time a booth babe ever worked in their favor was when we were going past the Secor booth. We saw a really stunning platinum blonde terminating fiber optics. And we stopped going, oh my God, she's probably a PhD in optics or something. Found out she had been hired that morning and was taught how to do fiber optics. So my read on is booth babes can be effective, but use them right. Don't use them strictly as eye candy.
Yeah, I like that. Also, on a personal note, I've just kind of found them demeaning. I remember at CES 2013, the crew and I actually did some footage at a now notorious booth that involved women in nothing more than body paint. I think they were supposed to be advertising some sort of USB drive, which was ridiculous. Now, we did a video there. We didn't actually include it in our special because we couldn't figure out a really good way to do that. But it always seemed a little weird if you were going to be there because of your passion for tech, that somehow putting out eye candy would draw you in. Let's start with a little enterprise bite. We've got, an interesting story here of how New York City is using big data databases and big data engines to predict where the next fire will be. That's right. They're going across a couple of databases that they use in the city, and they're making a new database that lets them predict where the highest fire hazards might be. Now, this new database includes data points like the neighborhood income, building age, electrical issues, and arson statistics. They use that to make correlations between those data points and where fires tend to pop up. Now, this is a very, I think, benign use of big data, but it seems kind of obvious, right, Chee? I mean, this is something that cities should start to look at. When you think about where our personal information is deposited, cities and government institutions have the most. They could put it to use the best.
Well, it's all about, you're trying to avoid the P word. People don't like being called profiled, but that's kind of what you're doing. You're trying to look for profiles on what trigger fires and so forth. Now, one thing that I always try and tell people is like, dudes, if you make this stuff really, really expensive, nobody's going to tinker with it. And that's one of the nice things about a lot of the big data engines, especially our friends at Splunk. You can now sit and tinker with big data engines without having to spend a ton of money. And I'll just bet you money that that's probably what the fire department did. They probably have some fireman that's maybe in an admin position that decided, let's go try it out and see what it looks like. And I'll bet you he probably saw that Major League Baseball example that Michael Wild showed off not the other couple weeks ago, sorry.
Yeah. Oliver, let me go over to you because Cheebert brings up an interesting point, and that is we want to avoid the P word, profiling. I mean, we don't want to just say, oh, yeah, that part of the city is always on fire. We would much rather say, well, here's some data points that we pulled out from commonly publicly available data, and it just shows us that, yeah, these areas tend to need more fire department assistance than others. Is there a way to use big data that isn't going to fall into that profiling trap?
Well, if you're doing it based on neighborhoods, I don't really see how that's profiling.
Okay, I get it. So if you were able to say, look, here's what we did. Here's the process. Here's the database we used. These are the data points that went in there. It's just simple data. There's no one back there going, oh, yeah, that we should go there. Or, yeah, we need to spend resources there. Then it becomes all right.
Yeah, I mean, if they start going into who failed a building inspection and, which building inspectors got bribed and things like that, then, yeah, that would be a problem. But if they're just going on historical data, I don't see how anybody can object.
All right. Well, I don't see how anyone should object, but Cheebert, that hasn't kept people from objecting in the past, right? One of the biggest fears about big data is that somehow, some way, it's the way we structure the query, the way we structure the correlation is going to fall into profiling. Right? I mean, we saw this before. We brought up a story here on Twite about 6 months ago when there was a government agency that was looking at the correlation between thefts and mobile phone usage, and they were using data that was coming from those towers. And they were able to make correlations that on paper looked really strong between what neighborhoods have crime and what might be the demographic makeup of those neighborhoods. As it turned out, it was completely wrong. The data was wrong. And I'm sorry, the data was right, but the way that it was correlated was wrong. Isn't that always the big fear of using a big data process?
Of course, you have to be able to ask the correct questions in the correct way. I always tell people, just guys, stop, think, do it by hand before you let a computer do it. Now, I will say, and I will back up, that profiling itself is not necessarily bad if, in certain circumstances. Of all the airports in the world that I've ever gone through, the airport that I felt by far the safest in was Tel Aviv. And our friends, the Israelis, do a whole bunch of profiling. And they do it very successfully, but they do it for the right reasons. So I'm sorry, America, sometimes profiling isn't a bad thing. Just watch the watchers to make sure they're doing it for the right reasons.
Folks, he can be found on Twitter, ADVNLab. So send him all the hate. I'm going to avoid that one. But let me throw this over to you, Raphael, because now we know where Heartbleed came from. We know the code that enables this bug to happen. Tell me, what have you started to see as far as its effect?
Okay, in terms of effect, first off, I think the response on this particular bug has been really good. I think the way that it was passed on to certain large providers first, like Cloudflare, Amazon, and others, saying, hey guys, just so you know, there's this SSL bug, giving them time to fix it and look at it before it went public was good. The public awareness is pretty good. And the last statistic I saw was that most of the top websites have had this fixed. Like the top 500, nobody's vulnerable to it anymore. And in like the top 1,000,000, you're looking at like 2.5% or something like that, which is a pretty good response. In terms of its effect, well, remember earlier when this bug came out, everybody was really worried. Like, oh my God, the SSL keys. What do we do about the SSL keys? Well, today in the news, it came out that in targeted attacks, you're starting to see actors take advantage of this bug to break into VPN sessions. Okay, so now what you're starting to see, it's awesome. I'm an attacker. Defend is good. No, but you're starting to see other uses of this bug. Okay, hey, where else is this? How can it be taken advantage of? And I think over the next few weeks or months, you're going to start seeing more and more kind of corner cases, more and more, oh, I didn't know that was possible, oops, kinds of things related to Heartbleed.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that I've seen in my inbox recently. I'm getting all these emails from major enterprise equipment vendors who have been reassuring me that their gear is not vulnerable, or download this firmware patch and it will take care of the OpenSSL bug. The funny thing is, not a lot of people paid attention to that because we were so focused on servers. Like you said, we wanted to make sure Facebook and Yahoo and Microsoft servers were all taken care of before we actually started worrying about whether or not our individual gear might have that Heartbleed bug. As you said, I think we're going to see that more and more. Now, I do want to throw in one story here and bring the boys back in, because if we start looking at what Heartbleed is actually costing us, we have now, just a week and a half later, a really good example of what it does. This comes to us from Wired. They spoke to people over at Cloudflare. As you said, they were one of the first to get word about this bug. And Cloudflare has been tracking activity from some of the certificate authorities. Specifically, they were tracking Global Sign to see what effect Heartbleed had on their network resources. What they found was that because Global Sign had to update their CRL, that's the certificate revocation list. It's a very small file that browsers can get from them that say what certificates are no longer valid. What certificates should you pull out of your lists? Well, that CRL grew from 22 kilobytes before Heartbleed to 4.9 megabytes after Heartbleed. That doesn't sound like a lot until you realize how many millions of times the list is going to be downloaded. The number of revoked certificates grew from 1,492 to 133,243. Now, the update caused a spike in requests for that CRL. All the browsers were going to Global Sign, asking if I could get your list to find out if I have any vulnerable certificates. Now, if we say that traffic typically costs about $10 per megabit per second, just the traffic from the CRL list alone would have cost Global Sign $400,000 since 10 days ago. Now, that's one provider, that's one certificate authority, and that's not even over. That's just the revocation list. That's not new certificates. Cheebert, let me bring you in here. This is kind of a nightmare, right? Because certificate authorities don't typically get this much traffic, and now legitimate requests for the CRL are almost acting like a distributed denial of service attack against Global Sign's own servers.
Oops.
Well, thank you for the color commentary, Cheebert.
No, this is yeah. And the problem is, it's not like you can go after a hacker or someone that had created a malicious code. It was a mistake, and there's really only one description for it, and that's oops. But yeah, it's caused an awful lot of people to go take an much harder look at their infrastructure And, there's been a bunch of people in the chat room saying, how do you find it if there's no logs? And I said, realistically, the only way I can see it is if you have something like an InfiniStream, just sucking down this metadata so that you can actually look at it at a later date. And I'll lay even odds. In fact, if someone in authority in Canada is willing to take this bet, I'll lay even odds they caught that person that grabbed all that information through using something like an InfiniStream, something that's recording all the connections that's coming through their infrastructure. I'll put a 20 on that one.
Now, Raphael, I want to throw that to you in a bit, because last week we talked about how the Canadian Revenue Service supposedly caught someone who was using Heartbleed to siphon records off of their network. But before we get to that, I want to throw the same question over to Curtis. Curtis, when we start to look at the actual business/financial toll that Heartbleed is going to take on the enterprise, there is going to be a lot of bandwidth costs. And we already know that. I mean, it's going to be substantial, especially if you're a certificate authority. There's going to be a lot of costs that go into IT departments to make sure everything is patched. We haven't even started looking at any potential damages from data that may have leaked over the last, 26 months, right?
Right. And that's the thing. People are getting very upset. But the fact is that to a great extent, any security damage that was done by Heartbleed is done. I mean, that horse is well and truly out of the barn across the county line into the next state. It's done. That doesn't mean that the costs are going to slow down. And for a company, whether they're a certificate authority or someone else, these are costs that can't really be delayed. I mean, think about this certificate authority. For a lot of online costs, most companies, let's say they do a promotion, people try to get into their servers because the promotion has been more successful than the company thought. They can throttle bandwidth, they can delay people, they can do all sorts of things. Something like this, you can't just tell customers, well, we know there's a huge problem, but you're just going to have to wait your turn before you get a remediation. You've got to answer the call. This is going to be huge. It's going to last for a while, and in many cases, it's going to echo up and down throughout the organization, hitting just about every part that deals with the public, deals with IT, deals with regulators, or deals with tallying up the cost for all these other departments.
Fantastic. Now, when we come back, Raphael, can I ask you about the Canadian hacker, the first real published use of the Heartbleed bug? Does that sound like a conversation we can have?
In what sense? I mean, I know as much as anybody else from reading the news story, and that's about it.
See, you say that, but then I see that smirk, and I don't believe you. If I told you right now there was a device hiding in each and every single one of our cities that could be used to unleash untold confusion and destruction in those major metropolitan areas. Now, these devices hold the fate of millions of Americans in their integrated circuits and could turn on us at any given time. Now, we know about these devices because they are our traffic lights. That's right. An Argentinian researcher by the name of Cesar Cerudo examined traffic systems around the world and found a flaw in the Census Network's VDS-240 wireless vehicle detection system. These sensors are installed at over 40 U.S. cities, as well as international locations around the globe. They don't control the traffic lights directly per se, but what they do is feed information on traffic patterns to the computers that do turn those lights on and off. Cesar discovered that the protocol used by the sensors, a proprietary protocol that works a little like Zigbee, lacks even the most basic security precautions. In other words, there is no encryption, and more so, there's no username or password. There's no authentication. If you can speak the protocol, if you're speaking on the right frequency, you can talk to the system. Now, he used an 802.15.4 wireless scanner to sniff the wireless traffic and found all communications to be in clear text and with no challenge response mechanism. Now, all you would need is a radio and patience, the ability to sit there and look at the traffic coming by and then mimic the traffic going over to those traffic computers. Now, here's the scary part. I could send data to enough of these sensors and enough of the connected computers to convince a city's grid of traffic lights that it was all clear and it was good to turn them green. Or I could vice versa, make it all red and say and cause a huge traffic jam, a jam log. Now, that's alone kind of scary. But Chee, let me throw this over to you first. We've known for a while, because we've been covering the SCADA stories, that our infrastructure is vulnerable. But at least with SCADA devices, there was a username and password. What on God's green earth would make people create a network-connected device that didn't even have the most basic security precautions?
I don't know. The hassle is the system is capable of digital signatures, and it is capable of login and passwords and so forth, and it's capable of encryption. I want to be very, very sure this is not Zigbee. Zigbee actually has that built in, and Zigbee is pretty secure. And oh, by the way, yeah, I did kind of help on getting Zigbee into the world.
Well, but see, that's the weird thing, Schubert. I mean, it seems as if they base this protocol off Zigbee. It's very Zigbee-like. So can you imagine any development process where you're thinking, okay, yeah, we're going to be using these around the world to send data to secured systems. Yeah, the Zigbee protocol that we're copying has authentication, it has encryption built in, but we're just going to strip that out. I mean, what decisions could possibly lead to that?
It was all about speed. They're running a mesh network over a really weird environment, lots of different RF all over the place. It's changing all the time. And apparently, I would imagine someone wrote the spec so tight that the manufacturer's only way of meeting that spec was to remove all encryption and logins.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's go over to Curtis, because I think we're now getting into his ballywick. This, if it plays out like Cheebert has said, and actually it sounds like that could be very plausible, sounds like a great example of people who are writing spec, writing policy, writing rules and regulation without actually understanding the tech. This is not the first time we've seen this in the enterprise, right? I mean, there are a lot of projects that seem to be backwards in their development. They get what you want it to do, and then you figure out what tech fits into it.
Oh, absolutely. And to be honest, I think what we have here is something that we heard about a long time ago when they were doing the investigation in the aftermath of the Apollo 1 disaster, when they decided that what had happened was really a failure of imagination. They just couldn't imagine that what happened did. In this case, you have a bunch of engineers who are trying to do the most with the minimum necessary investment in both hardware and in software and in other resources, and they just couldn't imagine that anyone would want to do anything with these signals. I mean, they're using a relatively uncommon wireless protocol. They are using a relatively uncommon networking protocol, and they're just dealing with sensors. Why on earth would anyone care about trying to hack them? Obviously, these are engineers who are deep into traffic and not at all into the hacker culture. This is something that we've seen over and over again when it comes to embedded control systems of all types. We're now finally seeing some of the other critical infrastructure starting to address this. I suspect what we're going to see now is a mad rush for the traffic control systems to layer some sort of security on top of their systems. But I guarantee you, given the way these things work, we've got another 3 to 5 years of vulnerable systems out there at a minimum.
Right. We've got M5 in the chat room who's saying, well, what kind of damage can be done with this system? Quite simply, imagine the traffic lights in any major metropolitan area, and they're really the only things that are keeping everything from disintegrating. I mean, think of a city like New York or like San Francisco. If suddenly the traffic lights were turning green and red at the wrong times, you could do that with this system, because you could convince the computers that there are clear streets when there are not, or that there are congested streets when there are not. Again, anytime you snarl the traffic arteries of any major metropolitan area, it's going to cause massive, massive confusion, hysteria, and who knows beyond that. Now, something I want to pick up on what Curtis said is this idea of this mad rush to add layers of security on systems that are now showing to be insecure. We've seen this with SCADA. We're now going to see this with these traffic systems. I'm just wondering what other systems, what other infrastructure systems are lying out there that have yet to be discovered, that have yet to be penetrated, that have yet to be audited as far as their security is concerned. This is a story we're going to have to pay attention to. Let's move on to the second enterprise bite. This one is sort of an IT facepalm. A physician does his own IT work and costs his hospital $4.8 million. Now, this comes to us from Network World, talking about how in 2010, a doctor who was part of the New York Presbyterian and Columbian University Medical Center was trying to, quote-unquote, deauthorize a personal device that he had attached to the hospital's network. In doing so, the physician reconfigured the network, opening up a major security hole. The leak was only discovered after the hospital received a complaint from a person who found personal medical information about their deceased partner on the internet. Now, the leak cost New York Presbyterian a $3.3 million settlement, while Columbia will need to fork over $1.5 million. Chee, let me throw this over to you. Especially working at a large environment like a university where there is a lot of personal information, along with a lot of information that needs to be private, this is like a nightmare scenario for you, right? I mean, this is worse than the network going down. This is something in the secret stash that becomes public.
Oh, I'm not allowed to talk about what happened, but UH has gone through this. It has been a problem. We've gotten to the point we're starting to call them spills. Oh, and a lot of it's because people are not paying attention. You know, the checks and balances aren't in place, and the ramifications aren't there. You know, when you have someone that's a senior to the organization, like a senior faculty member or a physician, the tendency, the knee-jerk reaction is to kowtow to them and give them anything they want. Why a physician had enough rights to be able to go and make those kinds of changes to an Active Directory infrastructure is beyond me. And that is why these people deserve every last cent they got, because that should not have happened. The checks and balances didn't work, and the physician had way too much authority. When this kind of thing happens, you know, when you start doing day-to-day work as an administrator, or the administrator account is given out to too many people, this is the kind of stuff that happens.
Chee, I want to continue because you touched on something very, very important, which is there is a cultural thing here. There's a societal thing here, which is there are some people, no matter what field they may be in, that are considered above reproach. And so when they start poking around in areas that they shouldn't be in, very few people are willing to stick their neck out and say, hey, doctor, should you really be doing admin for the hospital's network? This is not an isolated incident. I mean, I've seen this happen more notably in the enterprise when an executive who maybe has absolutely no experience with IT says, no, I need to be able to use my iPad at work because otherwise my daughter won't be able to play games when she comes visit me. This is the sort of stuff that we've become used to, right? I mean, IT managers would kind of laugh about it, but this is kind of a reality.
No, it actually goes even further than this. It's the arrogance and entitlement. I own the freaking company. I should have the administrator password. You know, I'm sorry. I just went through this with a restaurant this last weekend. And the owner of the restaurant, you know, obviously is entitled to the administrator passwords. But because he didn't have the experience, he gave them out to a point-of-sale company that were, let's call a spade, idiots. And they went and started making changes to the firewall and managed to lock out just about everybody from their system. This attitude of entitlement, that I'm entitled to the super user password, I'm entitled to make any changes I want, and you're going to fix it for me. The IT industry really and truly needs to go and slap them hard. I have a annoyance rate in my fee structure. And if someone goes and does something really, really stupid, they get the annoyance rate.
You know, Chee, I understand you. Sometimes I wish that you would speak more of your mind, you know, what you really think, instead of couching it in all these kind and gentle slaps. Chee, let's get right to it. We've got a story here that I actually really kind of like. It's kind of, I don't know, what would happen when someone's getting bullied around the schoolyard and they figure a really brilliant way to get back at their bully. Netflix, probably feeling a little down in the dumps by getting, let's just say, shanghaied by Verizon and Comcast bandwidth extortion, has resorted to a time-tested method of fighting against the bigger guy. Shame. That's right. Netflix has been adding a piece of text to their buffering screen that lays the blame for congested networks at the feet of those networks. By name, as you can see in this graphic, it says the Verizon network is crowded right now, adjusting video for smoother playback. Now, this has rankled Verizon, who seems to be named in a high percentage of those screens, those shame buffering, or what I call shuffering screens. In fact, it's bothering them so much that they sent a cease and desist letter to Netflix saying, indeed, in the first instance, responsibility for its customers' experience falls squarely on Netflix itself. Netflix has the ability to directly connect to every broadband network in America should it choose to do so. Instead, Netflix relies on a panoply of content distribution and other middleman networks to reach its customers, trying to lower its cost as much as possible. The cost-quality trade-off is one Netflix has chosen. Now, Cheebert, I want to throw this over to you first because the code in the open letter that Verizon wrote to Netflix is, well, Netflix chose to use the internet because the internet is about interconnected networks. But if they would just pay us to use our network exclusively for our customers, everything would be okay. So therefore, they're at fault. Makes sense, right? But I mean, this is actually true. I mean, Netflix does have a point in that Verizon has a point if Netflix truly wanted to provide uninterrupted service to Verizon customers, they could contact directly with Verizon to put data centers directly into Verizon's network and therefore provide much smoother, much better service. But then the problem is, that's no longer the internet, right? I mean, that's just building a lot of walled gardens, a lot of AOLs, and you have to buy your way into each and every single one of them.
Yeah, and I should also point out that Netflix is actually in some really, really cool facilities that have an insane amount of bandwidth and an insane number of cross connects. So I'm not feeling any love for Verizon complaining.
Yeah. Now, another interesting point in their letter is that they never claimed that they weren't throttling Netflix or the interconnects, but rather, again, it's Netflix's fault for not paying Verizon what they say is a connection fee, what everyone else is calling extortion, for the ability to connect to Verizon's customers. Now, Netflix did respond, and they wrote in their open letter, and I quote, "We are testing ways to let consumers know how their Netflix experience is being affected by congestion on their broadband provider's network. At present, we are testing in the United States in areas serviced by many broadband providers. This test started in early May, and it is ongoing. Our test continues." The interesting thing is that Netflix is drawing on some reports that they did and some information that came out of Level 3 that is showing that it's not just a matter of companies paying their due, but rather that there are some ISPs who mostly go unnamed, but we're going to name them here, Verizon, Comcast, Time Warner, who seem to be have the vast majority of oversubscribed links. Now, let me bring up some information. We covered this in a previous episode of Twiet, but I think it's worth repeating. Now, Level 3, which is one of the largest broadband backbone providers in the world, they connect pretty much everything. They may connect to tens of thousands of customers, but they really only have 51 peers. Now, those peers are located in 45 cities. Those peers are the way that information travels back and forth through different networks on the internet. Now, each peer is connected, those peers are connected to 1,360 10 gigabit per second Ethernet ports. Each peer has 1 to 20 interconnection points, which means that's a point which traffic can travel from one network to another. The average interconnection link is about 36% utilization, but 12 of 51 of their peers are congested at or above 90%. At that utilization, you see a lot of drop packets for several hours each day. 6 of those 12 are currently in the process of making upgrades, but the remaining 6, and again, you could probably guess which 6 those are chronically congested. Those peers are making no effort to upgrade their system to decrease that congestion. The scuttlebutt is that Verizon is one of the chronically congested peers that is not making any move to correct the congestion, at least not without being paid. Cheebert, let me ask you, because this again goes back to the fundamental nature of the internet, of the peering agreements, the peering arrangements in which networks agree to connect to one another to let the the traffic flow freely. Otherwise, we don't have an internet, right? I mean, that's why a lot of us are so upset, because that's what's at stake. If we start putting toll booths up, it breaks peering, which breaks the internet.
Oh, this is even worse. I don't know of any internet engineer that could keep their job if they let a link get all the way up to 90% congestion. Most people start looking at upgrading it right when it even hits into the 40-45% range. Once you get to 90, you can absolutely guarantee that things are going to break, and break dramatically.
Right. Yeah, I remember we saw a graphic not too long ago that showed you what traffic looks like. I mean, it spikes during the day. If you've got a 10 gigabit per second line and it's 30% utilized, it doesn't mean that it's always running at 30%. It'll go from 30% up to 100, back down, back up, back down. If you're at 90%, you hit those peaks, and when you hit the top, it means you're now dropping traffic. It means there's now traffic that's just falling on the floor and has to be retransmitted. And any IT administrator, anyone who has worked with networks, knows that that actually has a cumulative effect. If you have a lot of networks retransmitting their data, it actually increases the amount of bandwidth that has to flow through the network. So, Chee, let me ask you this. We've got Netflix doing the shaming thing. Do you think it will be useful in maybe educating the public as to the things they should be aware of?
You bet. You know, there is no one answer. There's no one person at fault. It is a shade of gray. And when you have a network as complicated as what's currently in the United States, there's a lot of cross connects. There's a lot of peering. There's a lot of this and that. But Verizon is starting to play a political game. It's not a technology issue. You know, adding ports, adding peering is not hard. These people know how to do it. But they are purposely saying, I want to make a whole heck of a lot of money by not paying those fees and not upgrading my links, and pass the buck.
Yeah, that's a little sad. Again, it's a complicated problem, and I'm not going to pretend that it's as easy as one company is bad, one person is bad. But I do believe we're definitely heading in the wrong direction. Let's move on to the second Enterprise Bite. We're talking about Google's Cybercrime Task Force. Now, this story needs a little bit of background. If we look over the last, say, 20 years of corporate response to gray hat hackers, we see that it's improved from the 80s and the 90s. Whereas in the 80s and 90s, hacker was synonymous with criminal, we've seen the Cold War de-escalate. Now, it's not perfect. AT&T pushed for the conviction of Weave, who found a security loophole on the AT&T website that exposed the information of thousands of iPad users. Microsoft sued a fair use hacker who exposed holes in their busted DRM. Apple is notorious for shotgunning cease and desist orders to anyone who dares peek under their hood. But then occasionally you get a company that does it right. And that company now is Google. Now, let's talk specifically about a hacker by the name of George Hotz. If you've been running in the scene, you know who he is. He's the guy who hacked the Sony PlayStation. He's the guy who was able to publish the first AT&T iPhone unlock, and he cracked Google's Chrome OS. Now, when he worked on the AT&T Apple crack, they ignored him. They tried to pretend like he didn't exist while they tried to patch the holes that he exploited. When he hacked the PS3, Sony sued him and made him promise not to ever hack their hardware again. Google took a different tact. They hired him. They paid him $150,000 for exposing the holes in Google Chrome OS, and now they've invited him to join a team of full-time elite hackers who hunt vulnerabilities in the software and services that drive the internet. Now, this is called Google's Project Zero. It's a group of top security researchers and hackers who spend all their time looking for zero-day vulnerabilities. The team is run by Google security engineer Chris Evans, and he's put together an elite team that includes Ben Hawks, who discovered bugs in Adobe Flash and Microsoft Office, Tavis Ormandy, who discovered zero-day flaws in antivirus software, Ian Beer, who discovered 6 bugs in iOS OS X and Safari, and, of course, George Hotz, who's acting as the team's intern. The interesting angle here is that Google will be finding flaws in other companies' code as well as their own. I want to throw this over to you first, Chebert. The idea here is that Google's trying to protect the internet. They believe that if people think the internet is safer, free of these zero-day bugs, that they're more willing to use the internet. And of course, Google makes money of people using the internet. Is this a sustainable business model?
I don't see why not. I've heard of teams like this that just aren't as public at a lot of different corporations. If you are a large corporation, you typically have a security team that may or may not have the talents to be able to go and find zero-day events. But boy, I tell you, anyone that's got the resources and got the funding will go and look for zero-day resources in whatever their corporation touches anyway. So in this case, Google, more power to you. Find those zero-day hacks. Make it a safer place. Because, boy, I tell you, there's an awful lot of people that don't want to touch the internet because they think just as soon as they connect, they're going to get hacked and their personal identifiable information is going to get misused for things like identity theft. So I can't see anything other than good coming out of this, but I can see Google's probably going to start running up against, folks like the NSA that don't like this. They want the vulnerabilities there, which I think is counterproductive to the good for the American economy.
Actually, let's talk a little bit about that. Curtis, one of the things that Google is known for, at least their security team, was when everything broke about the NSA and the spying, they actually had a public blog post that basically said, F the NSA, F this. They have publicly come out saying that they will do everything in their power to close all these zero-day exploits, all these bugs, so that the NSA cannot use them. Let me ask you this. This team is eventually going to be about 10 members, 10 elite hackers. It's going to have some of the resources of Google. But do you think they actually believe that they can close enough bugs to make a dent in what the NSA does? And do you think they believe they're immune to men in black coats coming over to have a chat with management?
Well, I suspect that they believe that they can close enough of the zero-day exploits to make the NSA have to work a lot harder. I think if you talk to them, they'd say that they really want to keep the NSA honest. If the NSA wants to work hard and find additional exploits and get in, God bless. But you don't have to hold the door open for them, which is what having lots of unexplored exploits or vulnerabilities tends to do. Now, as far as visits from men in black suits and dark glasses, I really do think that they are depending on Google's vast pot of cash to minimize those visits. Interestingly enough, it's also going to minimize the cease and desist letters from people like Apple and Sony. In the same way that engineers are covered by their employer's liability, this team is going to be covered by the vaunted legal department of Google. That's going to allow them to go into lots more places and find vulnerabilities in many, many more pieces of software. I'm not going to be surprised if we don't see an absolute wave of new vulnerabilities pointed out in the next 12 to 18 months.
Right. There's a discussion in the chat room right now on whether or not we trust Google. I don't think you have to trust the good intentions of Google. You trust that Google wants to make money. And they make money when people think that they can use the internet without having to fight off bugs and viruses. So this is in their best interest to be able to secure the internet. But, Chee, I want to throw this over to you because this is something that Curtis brought up. The vaunted legal department of Google. Yes, it's a lot of money. Yes, it's a lot of resources that they can draw on. But one of the strengths of any hacker has always been anonymity, the ability to pound on a server, the ability to pound and probe a service from relatively anonymous tools. If they're all working for Google's Team Zero, they kind of lose that, right? I mean, if they're now a sanctioned team, everyone knows who they are. And one of their mission statements is that they don't just look at Google services, just at Google software. They're going to be hammering at the software and the services of their competitors. Not even a vaunted legal team can protect you against that. I mean, Microsoft seeing a bunch of Google IPs suddenly hammering Azure is probably going to raise a couple of notes in their legal department, right?
Well, yeah, but that's kind of a, shall we say, let's put it this way. The Google team has some resources that just aren't equaled anywhere else on Earth. Hackers use anonymizing networks, but what happens when you control some top-level routers? Now all of a sudden, your digital footprint can be just about anything. They could go and search for unused address space and use that and anonymize themselves like crazy. And, Google's, if you're talking about the legal team, just look at OJ. My goodness. When you have a dream team to defend you, you can, in theory, get away with anything as long as you can go and create some sort of doubt in the jury's mind. So I think these guys guys and girls maybe, are going to be able to do some really, really interesting things. And I don't think the fact that their names have been disclosed is going to be that big a deal.
Capsula, a cloud security vendor who was actually on This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 103, talking about exploits they found in Drupal and WordPress. There have been an estimated 1 billion shell shock attacks since it was announced 4 days ago. Incapsula's own servers have detected and deflected more than 217,000 exploit attempts across their 4,115 domains. Digging into those attacks, Incapsula documented 890 offending IP addresses from across the world that were pushing the exploits. And more worrisome, most believe that this is only a warm-up while the exploit kits are prepared. One last bit of news breaking out of the Twit Brickhouse. According to staffer Jeffrey Needles, the 49ers still own the Eagles. Now let's get straight to the meat of the first segment. We welcome back to the show our security guru, Mr. Raphael Mudge, the Armitage hacker from AdvancedPenTest.com. Raphael, first of all, thank you for coming on Twit. I know you just finished a conference. You're probably pretty tired, and we really appreciate your time.
I'm glad to be here, Padre.
Now, every time you come on Twit, you scare the pants off of us. This time, you're coming to explain something to us that has been scaring and not scaring people over the last 4 days, and that is this shell shock, the bash vulnerability. First of all, how big is this? There's a lot of people saying that this is the biggest exploit that has ever been discovered, that this is far greater than the old Heartbleed bug. What does this mean to you as a security researcher?
Well, as a security researcher, I think this is a great opportunity for security researchers to get themselves in front of the media. And for security researchers everywhere, that's a really good thing for them. For the rest of you, this may not be that big of a deal. So everybody's still trying to figure out how deep this goes. But let's be very clear. This is not necessarily a problem in Bash. I mean, it is a problem, but it's more of a broken assumption. There's a lot of programs, execute stuff, will actually say, hey, I want to pass to the shell these parameters. I want to run this program. And it's well known you can't trust anything that comes from a user. You have to sanitize that. What people didn't realize before was anything that's passed to the environment to kind of configure things before you run the program, well, there's ways to get code execution off of that as well. And that's where the assumptions of Bash have been broken for folks, and that's why people are freaking out, and we've got potential problems to scrub for.
Right. Now, Mudge, the Born Again show was released back in 1989, so by any metric, it's old. It's really old, and in internet time, it's ridiculously old. So what are the assumptions that were made back in 1989 that don't hold true today?
Okay, so first, security is one of the things that evolves, right? Back in 1989, there probably wasn't the assumption that this command interpreter was going to constantly be fed to kind of internet-facing applications, or even, well, let me back up. Don't mind me, folks, if I seem a little scrambled. I'm fighting a little bit of a migraine today. So this idea that the environment, I think folks assumed it was safe. I used to write scripts, web applications, using something called CGI, the Common Gateway Interface, in the late 1990s. And I would stuff data into the environment all day long and kick off an application to run, and I always assumed it was okay. I didn't assume that there was a way for a user to provide something that would trigger Bash into actually executing the next piece of data as a command and letting them do whatever they want. So that's a pretty big assumption that's been broken for a lot of old applications.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me ask you this, because it was released on Thursday of last week, but within hours, we already saw attacks in the wild. Is that typical? Do you see that? I mean, we didn't see that with Heartbleed, where the proof of concept came out, and then immediately we started seeing attacks en masse. What makes Shell Shock different in that it can be implemented so quickly?
Oh, sure. It's really easy to check for in a simple case. All you're doing is, I'll give you an example. So when I browse to a website, some information gets passed from my browser to the web server in the headers, like my user agent, which browser I'm using. And sometimes, I was checking my servers for this last week, sometimes the environment you might run an application from might automatically pass that information to the environment of any programs you run. And so all somebody had to do was just change their user agent to say, hey, I'm a bash function, semicolon, here's the stuff I want to run. So it was very trivial to check for and to actually make it do something of possible interest to an attacker. And some folks were doing this just to see how many hosts on the internet might have been in this trivial case I brought up, demonstrating vulnerability to this. One person at Eradisec, I think .org.com, he swept the internet and tried to run ping via his user agent variable. And he said he got back about 3,000 responses. Whether or not what he did to test was ethical, but that's a whole other debate.
Right. Let me ask this, because I think this is a question that a lot of people have been wondering about since this was announced, and that is, how does it actually work? So if you were to explain to a layman how this born-again shell from all those years ago, which every Linux user who is worth his salt knows how to run, could be exploited in this way. What is the attack? How does it work? How would you run it if you were an attacker?
Okay, sure. So let me explain it like this. So when you run the shell, it's a command interpreter, right? You put in your commands and it runs it, gives you back output. That's not the whole game, though. The shell also has something called an environment. And in those environment are variables, things that you can set. You can do things like set display equals :0 to say, hey, this is my X Windows display. Here's where I want you to put programs. That's, a Unix thing. So you can configure all programs that run now and into the future through these environment variable options. Normally, it's considered pretty harmless. What was not realized, though, was that you could, one, define a function in environment variable, or I should say that is realized is kind of considered okay. Like, say, hey, I've got this variable. The beginning of this variable is a bash function, which by itself is harmless, is not being called or invoked. But if you put a semicolon after that and put in another command, when that environment's loaded, the fact that a function is defined there and then a semicolon, some other command, the other command gets executed. And that's something, it's more of a side effect. It is a bug. It wasn't intentional, but it's just a surprise side effect that's led to implications for whether or not you could put untrusted user input into your environment. And the answer is no, you can't. Until last week, none of us, I certainly didn't, realize that.
Right. Again, as a security researcher, would you say that this was probably found out by someone just pounding on bash and realizing that if you appended a bunch of information to the end of the script, it executed?
So last week, I saw on Thursday the coordinated disclosure on the bug. I didn't dig far enough yet. Went off to a conference, just got back, and who discovered it and what the circumstances were of how they discovered it. So I can't answer how that came about, but we should be very thankful that it has been found so we can address it and going forward, avoid problems like this.
Let's talk about addressing it in just a bit. I want to bring Cheebert back into the discussion. Cheebert, you work in an academic setting, on a campus, a university campus. And there's already been a press release from Apple saying, look, most of the people who use our devices aren't going to be vulnerable to this. There's already been releases saying unless it's a server and it has a CGA, a common gateway interface, it's probably not going to be affected by this. But like, for example, the Encapsula data that we got this morning shows that, yes, there have been tens of thousands of exploited machines, but there's a decent percentage, like 6 or 7%, that are not servers. So obviously, this extends beyond just boxes sitting in a data center somewhere. What are the concerns in an environment like yours?
Oh, keep in mind, there only 6 or 7% may not be servers, but I'll just bet you 6 or 7% are people that have their sharing turned on.
Right.
Especially on Macs, it's really, really easy to share a folder, share this, share that. VNC is got kind of a web-ish front end. So when you start turning sharing on Macs or whatever's, and you don't remember to turn it off, you leave those vulnerabilities open. So I'll just bet you, well, maybe I won't bet, but I'll lay even odds that some of the problems that I'm having currently on the University of Hawaii campus is because people haven't caught up on their patching. At my school, we've been patching like crazy, and SonicWall actually gave me a private bulletin on Friday, so I've been patching since Friday.
We welcome back to the show, I think he was here over 2 months ago, Mr. Steve Gibson. That's right. Steve Gibson himself from Security Now, author of Spin Right, the mastermind behind Shields Up. Steve Gibson, grc.com. Steve, thank you so very much for coming back on Twiat.
Great to be here.
We brought you in specifically because there's been a few interesting security-based stories this past week, and I thought we could pick your brain just a tiny bit.
Yeah, you guys were talking earlier about region, which is really interesting. It's Symantec first detected this thing in 2008, so 6 years ago, and it was active through 8, 9, 10, and 11, and then sort of went off the map completely. It just, whoever it was who was behind it stopped actively using it until 2013, when suddenly it got reactivated again. And from the analysis, this is like Stuxnet in being extremely complex. It's a sort of a multi-stage installer that has a dropper and then 2 levels of different loaders that chain together before you get to a modular architecture of kernel level drivers that are very extensive in their capabilities. I mean, the way this thing looks, there's just no way this is like hobby malware. For example, one of the modules is used for dissecting the protocol used in cellular base station communications, which requires extreme expertise in that specific discipline. So, essentially, what we have found is a very widespread, interestingly targeted new kind of malware. For example, 28% of the installations are aimed at the backbone communications infrastructure of telecommunications companies. So everyone believes this is a nation state. And as you guys mentioned, it looks like the original language of origin is English.
Right. Now, it's interesting. I've heard 2 pronunciations for this. Some are calling it region. I've heard it pronounced Reagan. Which one do you use?
Well, it's REGIN. So I think you can kind of go either way. I don't really know where it came from, why they named it that. So without sort of getting a clue as to what the source of the name was, it's hard to know how you want to pronounce it. So I was just going region.
Right. Now, the news that I've been reading about this has been, it's actually kind of fascinating. I know that there are nefarious purposes at play here, but it is ridiculously complicated. I mean, that's why most experts are saying that this had to have the backing of some sort of nation state. It was discovered by security researchers, some of which were at Symantec. As you mentioned, it's been in the wild for 6 years in various degrees of usage. That whole modular approach the fact that you've got, let's see, what were the stages? The first part was like the Trojan.
The dropper.
Right, the dropper. That's the Trojan horse.
Right.
Then you had stage 1, which was a loader. Stage 2 extended the loader based on what kind of system it was infecting. Stage 3 is the initial kernel framework. Stage 4 is the expansion of the kernel framework to do specific jobs, and then the user framework. And stage 5 is the payload. So, and each stage wouldn't work until the previous stage was decrypted. So obviously they put the time into thinking, how can we obfuscate this malware so that people only know about it once it's too late?
Well, and so what this says is, we've used the term before in smaller contexts, APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, meaning that it's something which typically an enterprise, and I'm thinking, for example, RSA famously found this advanced persistent threat in their network, living within their own internal infrastructure. This thing sort of is a squared, advanced squared persistent threat. And your comment about the way it's been designed to hide suggests that it was the entity behind it knew that they were going to be investing substantially in this. And you need to think of this sort of as a framework onto which can then be plugged modular specific items. So a lot of this is reusable, and then presumably when whoever this is going after a particular industry or a particular country or a particular sector of some sort, they'll design specific components that they then add to this structure. My point is that what this says is, if we're going to invest this much time and energy, we need it to have a long life. And if it's going to be able to exist out on the internet, it needs to be able to hide. It needs to be extremely stealthful. So a huge amount of effort has gone into the stealthiness of this thing.
Yeah, we'll get back to the stealthiness, but I want to bring in some my co-hosts here. Cheebert, you first. We've got CR1 in the chat room. I think he's joking, and he's saying, well, as long as it doesn't slow down my nuclear fuel centrifuges, I don't care, because that was Stuxnet. But in a lot of ways, this one scares me more, because whereas we've seen malware and we've seen attacks that are going after intellectual property, they're going out after proprietary business information, this one isn't really an IP malware. This is not looking for your bank account. It's not looking for files on what you're going to be doing next quarter. This was looking for people. So this one was
espionage.
This is espionage. It was isolating individual entities, individual people, and some of the modules that they're starting to dissect here are fascinating. They found one that seemed dedicated to looking at airline schedules. So they're looking for when people are traveling. They found one, as Steve said, that was looking at breaking into GSM base stations so that they could intercept traffic. They also found one that looked for hotel rooms. So they looked for where people were actually staying when they were traveling. So this was a comprehensive suite to track people who were connected to the internet in any way, shape, or form. Wow. Cheebert, this is kind of a different level of cyber warfare, right? I mean, now you're going after individuals.
Yeah, this is clearly a human intelligence tool, and this is clearly designed and supported by someone that has the philosophy of collecting grains of sand. There's a saying in the intelligence community is, if you collect enough grains of sand from all kinds of different places, pretty soon you have a beach. And that's what this is. This is a very large organization. Just the way it's set up is clearly a large team. And it's also very clearly someone that has a lot of patience and can do really, really long-term planning. This is definitely something to be afraid of. For people like, that have been in the intelligence community, this is kind of a worst case scenario, because now all of a sudden, maybe that grain of sand is, oh, gee, what did some intelligence community do 20 years ago? Because that will tell me what they're doing now by using building blocks. And that's the kind of human intelligence that someone needs to be really afraid of. And I'm hoping this was written by a U.S. organization, because, man, I sure don't want this for some of our foreign competitors.
Well, I mean, if you look at the numbers, and go ahead and drop over to the Symantec site, Brian. If you look at the infection rates, so right now they're talking about 5% in Afghanistan, 5% in Iran, 5% in Belgium, 5% in Austria, 5% Pakistan, 5% India, 9% Ireland, 9% Mexico, 24% Saudi Arabia, 28% in Russia. So there definitely seems to be a slant. This thing was aimed. It wasn't just let out in the wild. And it looks like a lot of those smaller numbers are ways to get to the larger targets. The infection targets themselves, if you break it down even more, go ahead and scroll down a tiny bit more. 5% went to energy, 5% went to airlines, 5% went to research, 9% to hospitality. That's the whole going after hotels and such. 28% telecom. So they're definitely trying to intercept data that's passing over telecom networks. And 48% went to private individuals and small to medium businesses.
Well, and they haven't really identified the infection vector. Again, this is one of the aspects of it that is inherently modular. So they believe they found an instance where Yahoo Instant Messenger was exploited through an unverified vector in Yahoo Instant Messenger, but even in looking at this really closely, because it expends so much effort in obfuscating its own operation, it's difficult for people who even know it's there to know what it's doing.
Right. This is actually one of the things we brought up with Raphael Mudge when he talked about advanced persistent threats. It obfuscates its communication. So it's using random ports, or it uses ports of commonly used network tools. Like, for example, it will use ping. It will use the FTP ports. So even if you're looking at traffic through your network, it won't necessarily seem like bad traffic.
Hiding in plain sight.
Hiding in plain sight, which is the best way to do it. Let me bring in my other co-host here, Curtis. We say that this is not a IP malware. This is not going after trade secrets. This is not one of those pieces of malware that was able to download gigabytes of information on some secure project. But that's not to say that this wouldn't still be useful in the enterprise. I'm just thinking specifically if you were able to follow the executives of a competing company, that in and of itself is an incredible intelligence tool, is it not?
Oh, it absolutely would be. And let's look at what some of the common features of the countries that are being primarily affected here. Russia, Saudi Arabia, Mexico. The thing that they all have in common is oil. And if you can figure out who's talking to whom about oil, that could give you some major insight into what could be happening with oil prices. And we know that a very small bit of insight into what's going to happen with oil prices can mean billions upon billions of dollars in someone's pocket. So the rationale for and incentive to infect telecom companies to find that kind of information is tremendous.
Well, and we know the power of metadata. And for example, who is booking hotel reservations where tells you who is meeting with who. And so you can make inferences even without listening to people's conversations. We've talked famously about like cellular phone metadata and how, from looking at the interconnections of cellular phones, you can determine an awful lot about someone, even if you don't listen to the conversations. Well, things like hotel reservations and airline flights is real-world metadata of, who people are meeting with and where they're traveling. And exactly as Curtis was saying, that sort of says, oh, look, this sheikh is over here now having a meeting probably with these people who are located in that city. And from that, you're able to make inferences. The other thing we haven't talked about yet is this also contains a sophisticated remote access Trojan, a so-called RAT, which is capable of capturing screenshots from the machine that it's resident in, taking over the user's mouse point-and-click operations, stealing passwords, monitoring that local machine's network traffic, and even recovering files that have previously been deleted from its hard drive.
Okay, we can kind of laugh at it because, as far as we know, there are no infections in the United States. It seems
none of us are infected.
None of us are infected. But
none of us have it.
But on the other side, Steve, I got to be thinking, well, we can't be the only one working on a tool like this. maybe Regan was a nation-state sponsored malware, but there's got to be other countries that are working on exactly the same thing. Yes,
yep.
It's an arm race, right? That does it for the best of 2014. I want to say on a personal note that I thank each and every single one of you for tuning in for Twiat every single week. We couldn't do this show without you, and to you I owe a great debt of gratitude. I also want to thank everyone here at the studio who I thank each and every single week, and I never mean it any less. To Lisa, to Leo, to Carson, my super producer, and of course to Brian, my TD, who really is my rock, my strong place, my wind beneath my wings. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you in the new year. Until then, I'm Father Robert Ballecer. And remember, if you want to know what's going on in the Enterprise, just keep Twiat.